All right. Welcome back, everyone, to Griffith Observatory and our all-day celebration of the 50th anniversary of man's first footsteps on the moon with Apollo 11 on July 20th, 1969, 50 years ago today. By this time, 50 years ago, they had landed. They were getting ready to suit up and go out on the surface. And so history was already being made. Today, we've been having a series of half-hour presentations, each taking a look at the past, present, and future of our place on the moon, mankind's place on the moon. And I guess with Artemis, I can say humankind, because finally some women are going to get to go. So this is the last of our short presentations, and it's about the long-term future. What awaits for us 50 years from now? We're looking back in time 50 years. What happens 50 years from now and even beyond? Will we go back to the moon? Should we go back to the moon? Who will go back to the moon? And what will we do there? So this, as I say, is the last of our presentations. I'm joined here today by veteran space journalist Leonard David, who has written countless books and articles and edited magazines and so on. And in fact, tomorrow night he's giving a book talk of his most recent book published by National Geographic. There's the nice yellow logo, yellow rectangle, called Moon Rush. And it's all about this subject, about who's going back. There's a big rush for the moon. I think the name probably comes after like Gold Rush. A lot of people recognize some potential on the moon, and a lot of different, it's not just a national enterprise anymore. People from all over the world, private enterprise, who all is headed back to the moon. So Leonard will be doing a book talk tomorrow, and you can get the book and have him sign it, and we invite you back to attend that. If you can't join us, then at least you can enjoy it on our live stream Griffith Observatory TV broadcast. Next to Leonard is Anthony Cook. He's our astronomical observer, and my partner on All Space Considered. All Space Considered is the first Friday of every month at 7:30 p.m. in this theater, and we bring you the latest and greatest in space and astronomy news. So if you want to keep up with what we're doing, you can follow us on all of our social media. It's all got the name All Space Considered, and because Twitter doesn't let us have many characters, it's All Space Considered. So, but you can find it if you Google it, and we're easy to find, and we hope you'll follow us. So as I mentioned, our talk today, our last one today, is our future on the moon. And we had fun making this one because a lot of times you see artwork, and you're going to see a bunch of artwork that looks kind of sterile. A lot of modules and people in outfits and spacesuits and so forth. But in fact, of course, if we're going to live on the moon in the future, we're going to have to make it habitable. We're going to have to grow food. We're going to have to be able to live off the land. And so I rather like the artwork that our team, led by Katie here, I just want to say thank you to Katie, created for this event. So, of course, last we left the moon, just shy of 50 years ago, that was one of our great accomplishments. We got there. We walked on the moon. I hope you heard our hoax, no hoax talk earlier. It definitely happened. There are footprints on the moon left by Apollo astronauts. And that leaves us with, what is next? They head back to Earth, and we haven't been back since 1972. So our long-term architecture for this is the idea is that we will send people back to the moon, but that is a gateway to send people to Mars. I want to take a quick poll, and you get to vote for either one or the other. If you could go, or your children, or someone that you have any interest in, would you rather go to the moon, or would you rather go to Mars? How many of you would like to go to the moon? And how many of you would like to go to Mars? That's about 50-50. I got to admit, I'm surprised. So that's pretty great. Well, in this picture, we're going to try to do both. And as it says on this slide, the moon is the proving ground where we can learn how to live and work off the surface of the Earth, but only do it 2.5 days away. So that if we go all the way to Mars, which is on the scale of our model on the front lawn, if you saw the Earth-Moon system on the front lawn, Mars is 3 miles away. So it's a lot farther to get to Mars. So the moon, next step for learning how to live and work off the surface of the Earth, and eventually, hopefully, onto Mars. So what might that look like? Well, we're going to need a place to live. And some of the things that we may need are, life support, protection from radiation, the ability to grow food, the ability to recycle waste. All of the things that we need to do here on Earth are things that we'll need to be able to do on the moon. Get energy, turn energy into useful energy for living. So here's another picture of a little habitat where you might rove around the moon, go in, and this is actually a subterranean habitat. The idea is you go in there and you take a shower because the lunar dust is so sticky and it moves around so much, it gets on everything. And you don't want to be bringing all that lunar dust back into your habitat. So this is actually a real challenge for getting back to the moon and living and working there, is how to handle the copious lunar dust that floats around the surface. You'll need communications, you'll need transportation. There's a nice lander coming in. It's not going to be all on its own. It's going to be an outpost from Earth. And so all of the necessary communication and infrastructure will be required. And you often see artwork that looks like this. And there's just more big mining facilities. Maybe we can make resources, make use of lunar mining. And of course, you're going to want to drive around the moon in a snazzy car. So that's important. I think our last one of this series of artwork is just more of the same, people on the moon, but in this case, they're also setting up telescopes, trying to do astronomy from the moon. And in fact, one of the long-term goals is to potentially put a radio telescope on the far side of the moon, because believe it or not, if you can see the Earth, it's radio noisy. So the only place really locally in the solar system to go where you have radio quiet is on the far side of the moon, so where you can't see the Earth. So there's some interest among the radio astronomers of the world to go put a radio telescope on the far side of the moon. So all of this requires infrastructure, all of this requires effort and investment. And so I think the first question that I want to ask of Leonard and Tony is, why? What will drive us to go back to the moon? What's going to make all this happen? I mean, I don't think people are just going to spend capital to go fulfill these pretty pictures. You got to have a reason to go back. So what is that reason? Do we have a motivation to go back to the moon?
Well, all that artwork, you got to make that true. That's part of it. It's going to be a little bit more difficult than that, but I'm a big believer that the moon is a stepping stone to bigger targets, Mars and beyond. So, however, how old am I now? 72. I signed up for being interested in space when I was a kid and saw Werner von Braun's timetable. We're so far behind. We should have been an Alpha Centauri by now. So I'm a little disappointed. How you get older, you start realizing there's more to society than the space program. So a constancy of purpose is what NASA is talking about right now. And that's the trick. I'm a survivor. I spent 30 years in Washington, D.C. covering NASA and watched a lot of visionary programs in space come and go. So we got to have a constancy of purpose. There's other things that are going to happen in the next few years that will help drive that, I think. But I think the moon is, how many people here have seen the moon?
In the sky?
Yeah, in the sky. I mean, it's up there. It's over there. It's close.
If you have any trouble, I do the Sky Report. We just publish weekly on our website, and it'll tell you how to find the moon.
People say it's the 8th continent. You know, it's. I think there's a scene in the movie 2001 of Clavius Crater where they, and why did they go there? The monolith. And I think there are lots of monoliths on the moon that we just don't know about. And when I say monoliths, I mean it's mystery. I think
Okay,
it's-
let's be very clear about that. You're not saying aliens placed
No, I'm
monoliths on.
just saying the moon is going to teach us some new things. I think we got some surprises coming, including helping us understand how it got there, how it was composed, and the history of the moon that will give us traction to learn more about the Earth. So the moon looms. I think it's going to be part of our future.
So you're saying it's pretty much unavoidable because it's there and it's in our spirit and we're going to go?
It may be not in the U.S. spirit. And I think Anthony wanted to talk a little bit about other countries that are coming. This
Yeah.
is going to be a very...
Well, China, is also exploring the moon as we speak. They have a rover on the far side of the moon and a relay satellite to communicate directly with the Earth continuously. So they're actually exploring the moon now. And I actually think the reason that they've given for doing this is a compelling one that I hope that we embrace. And that is that, in order to support our population comfortably, and end poverty, things like that, eventually we're going to need the resources of space. There are a lot of resources in space. Asteroids, for instance, have lots of material that can be mined. But it would be expensive to try to mine them directly from the Earth by launching rockets straight to asteroids. The moon also, and something we learned after Apollo, is that the moon seems to have resources. There is water, which eluded us until the 1980s. So in some form there's water. We don't know maybe how much. Will it support civilizations on the moon? We don't know. But what it could support are refueling stations for exploring the solar system. So that's one maybe compelling reason why we'd want to start developing things on the moon. And that would open up the rest of the solar system for whatever we want to use it for exploring or for resources. But I think we have to learn a lot more about the moon until we can pin everything on it. But if the moon does have those resources, we should know, and we can make use of them. So China's doing it. If we don't, we're kind of handing it over to China eventually. I don't think I think the time's kind of ripe for this. If we don't act on something now, we'll eventually lose our ability to and will to do it.
Do you agree with that, Leonard? Do you think we've got to strike now, or it's lost to us as at least our country as a national effort?
Well, I think the Chinese card is going to be played here. The Chinese just the other day are still seemingly on track to bring a return sample back from the moon. That hasn't been done robotically since 1976 with this former Soviet Union. So they're on a path, and I look at their hardware. It's not you can't just dial up China and like NASA public relations and get all the information. But in piecing it together, they got a pretty substantial program. They're going to be putting up their own space station starting in the next few years. So they're going to be much more in the headlines, and they may lose Chinese astronauts. I mean, we'll see how they react to loss of life on their program. But I'm pretty convinced that the moon has got some surprises for us, and if we really explore with the right scientific tools, I think we're going to find some very interesting new developments on the moon.
Before we leave the subject of China, what is their timescale for putting people on the moon?
Well, they're talking. There isn't, the formal government statement, I don't believe has ever been made. You get some of the scientists. Sometimes you meet them at meetings, and they're looking at 2030s, I think, something like that. It's the last kind of date that they're hand waving about. But we'll see.
So
they
a
may
much
speed up
longer
their
time
program.
for us. The
Yeah.
United States, the Artemis program that we talked about in the last program, has the goal of putting astronauts back on the moon in 2024. a pretty rushed schedule.
Yeah.
But it sounds like the Chinese are taking a little more slowly and steadily.
And there's a little bit of kind of a fascinating turn of events with the European Space Agency. They want to put a moon village together, and they're looking for a mayor of the moon village, so raise your hand. But they're putting together a pretty robust plan themselves, working with the Russians and Chinese on moon village. So we'll see what that turns out to be. But I think that's why we call it the moon rush. I mean, there seems to be a definite movement by many countries, and then we have the private sector interested in the moon exploration. So it's going to be a real interesting return to the moon this time. But this time to stay, that's the question. Can we pull that off?
Yeah, you hear a lot of the phrase flags and footprints, that Apollo was flags and footprints, and to some extent it was. We had an interesting discussion about this the other evening where several people were making the comment, hey, I thought this was the gateway to living and working in space, and then the whole thing ended. But in fact, the goal of Apollo was to put a man on the moon, show that we could do it, and it really wasn't to open up the space frontier as many of us kids thought it might have been when we were that age. And we, like you said earlier, we should be at Alpha Centauri by now. I think a lot of people in our generation thought this would be happening. So here we are dreaming again. Are we just crazy dreamers and it's completely out of any sense of reality? And Tony, I'll turn that to you. Are you a crazy dreamer?
Well, I try to be optimistic, but I also try to temper that a bit. We know, for instance, that living in the space station for a year is not good for you. You do have health effects, and even with your eyes, and your brain is affected and stuff, and possibly even some genetic, at least your genes change a little bit. Structure,
The expression of the gene.
yeah, the stuff holding the genes together changes a bit. So it's an effort to, it's not really great for you to stay in space for a long time that way. We know you're exposed to radiation. What we don't know is any other gravity prescription besides what we find here on Earth, does any other gravity besides one gravity like we experience on Earth permit you to live a full life? I mean, can you reproduce, for instance, on other gravities? The only places we can think of where it might be habitable enough even to walk on are the moon, where it's 1/6 as much gravity as Earth, or Mars, which is something like 1/3 as much gravity as Earth. And we just don't have any data as to whether people can actually survive a full life in that kind of gravity. So I think it's premature to say that we will settle these places, at least without genetic engineering and stuff taking place. But we should be finding out. We've had a space station now for over 20 years, and we haven't answered that question. So so that's something that we really need to find. Going to the moon might help with that. We might get bad news. Maybe we'll get good news. Maybe it depends on who's there. On the moon, on Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong's heart rate kept rushing up past 140 up to 160 by the end of his spacewalk, and doctors were afraid he was going to pass out. Buzz Aldrin stayed, 80, 90, something like that. His heart didn't rush. So maybe some people are more inclined to be able to do it than others.
So in the panel that you had the other evening, there was a fair bit of discussion about solar power satellites, and the idea here is that we could pick up solar energy in space and beam it back to Earth via microwaves. Let me just say this is a very contested idea because of some of the dangers involved of beaming microwaves, like a big microwave oven pointed back to Earth. So I just wanted to actually ask you, Leonard, because you were there, Tony, but Leonard, there's this discussion. And let me say that a lot of people use this as a rationale. You had said we need a good, long, sustained rationale. So why go back? To build telescopes? I don't know that that's going to do it. To mine materials? Can we show that there's a return on investment? Do we even know what future markets hold? There's so much uncertainty about what's happening on this planet and what will happen with our ability to survive with water resources and energy resources and so forth. So, can we put together, do we see a path for such a sustained rationale to go back? One of our speakers earlier this week felt that being able to get power from space was such a rationale.
And you could get power from the moon. I mean, the thing's full of silicon. You could create solar cells, and one Japanese company, Shimizu, has already looked at creating almost a ring around the moon to collect solar energy and beam that energy back to Earth. So that's, again, the pictures are cheap, but the moon's available for doing those kinds of things. I think the one thing we got to be careful of, if pessimism was a rocket fuel, we'd be out of the solar system by now. I think we're going to have a bunch of surprises. Maybe some of them will be, catastrophic or mission possible. But I think not doing it doesn't seem right. Doesn't seem right, given a legacy of space exploration. And here we are, 50 years. I lived through all those missions and an amazing period of time. But it's also not your father's or mother's NASA. It's different today. There's all kinds of different possibilities and different things that NASA's doing.
Can you say a little bit about that? I know you talked about it in the last one, but I think there's a lot of other new people in this audience. What's different today?
Well, it is the leftovers of an agency that's sort of been beaten up, by political shifts, political winds change. In Washington, D.C., in those 30 years, I went through a bunch of presidents, and at some point they all have a vision, and all of a sudden there's no money for the vision. The vision needs glasses. There's people trying to figure out how much money is available, and the program always slides off into the Never Land. So it is that constancy of purpose this time, and I'm not sure. That's why I left Washington, D.C. I got too cynical myself, so moved to Colorado. But we may have a good shot at it. There's a lot of other things going on the sidelines. I don't want to get into this too much. The military is interested in the moon again. There's a definite shift in military strategy with the Space Force and all these kind of things. Cislunar space is becoming a military target of interest, just like low Earth orbit, geosynchronous orbit. So the military is starting to play an interesting role here on the sidelines that very few people are aware of, but it'll become more visible, I think, in the next few years.
Will you talk more about that tomorrow?
Yeah.
Great. I was unaware of this. I look forward to that.
Yeah.
So I guess I'd like to just ask the audience for a moment. I mean, we have no content we can give you because we're in the realm of science fiction. We're talking about what will happen 50 years from now, and there are so many unknowns that there's no way we can stand up here, sit up here as experts and say, oh, this is going to happen. We can speculate, we can read the winds, we can try to use 50 years of experience to see, how things happened before and if the conditions will make them happen again. But you all are in that same situation, looking to the future and wondering what the future might be like. So I'm just curious to ask, how many of you think that 50 years from now we will have some infrastructure on the moon? And how many of you think, nope, not going to happen? So a little bit more than half. So I think the further west you get, maybe the more optimistic, huh? So that's pretty good. Everybody in earlier panels said, oh yes, it'll be a going mining concern, and I'm afraid I'm on the cynical side of things. I think it's going to be, 50 years goes by very quickly. It's frightening enough for anybody who's over 50. You know what I'm talking about. And so it's hard for me to see, such a big change happening on our moon going forward. One of the things you mentioned earlier is that the South Pole, or that we need water on the moon, and that's why we have these kinds of architectures, where you have permanently cratered permanently shadowed craters, which may have water ice in them. And here's just a little depiction of what a base might look like. You go in underground, you've got communications and science labs and finally habitation. But all of that is buried safely underground where it's shielded from all the intense radiation. And it would need to be in a region where we could find permanently shadowed craters. So this would be a first step that we could maybe take, build such things. But then there are even more extravagant visions long-term of SpaceX. Did you want to say a word about the SpaceX?
Well, yeah, next year, in fact, some of you may actually own a ticket to go into space.
Anyone here?
Okay, but you'll be able to drive to New Mexico probably next year and fly at least one spacecraft into suborbital space, Virgin Galactic. Also, you could go to Texas and take Blue Origin into space on a suborbital flight. So people, you could buy your way into space, and I'm sure the price will plummet. SpaceX, a local company in Hawthorne, is building something that's just really mainly designed to carry lots of tourists. It could carry them from city to city or to Mars, depending on if it works. But it actually, the test vehicles there's a competition in SpaceX on 2 different locations of building this thing, and next Monday they said they might fire up the engines on it. So they are working on something. So there is alternatives to the government, vision of how we proceed into space. You may be able to buy your way into it. There's a Japanese businessman who is financing some of this, and he has his ticket, and he's going to take 25 friends around the moon if it works. So,
If he called you up, would you go? Yes. Yeah? How many would go? I would say none in your life. That's far too dangerous. I'm kind of in the... I know. I used to want to go to the moon, but yikes.
I got tucked into a helicopter ride into the Grand Canyon, which I thought I'd never do. But the person who ran the tour is also a psychologist, but he said, if you ever think you're going to do something and you have a chance to do it, your only chance to do it is if you do it. So, and I said, yeah, all right.
And you're here to tell the tale.
And I'm glad I did it. It was an incredible experience.
So perhaps we'll have tourists. And then I particularly like this artwork. Someday in the future, arts, it's not just habitats, rocks, and food. Arts, culture, flourishing, and with a whole new perspective. How many of you read science fiction? Or watch science fiction on TV? How many like The Expanse? I love The Expanse. So there's a vision with whole cultures developing because we've moved off the Earth and we're creating a new set of identities associated with different locations in the solar system. So a lot is possible. I can't say anything's possible. It has to be within the laws of physics. But I think that is the dream and the vision, and it does go beyond artwork because the artwork comes out of our desire to see this dream come true. And it's a very widespread dream. So, of course, we talked about the motivation potentially being financial, that there could be some mining. That's yet to be demonstrated. But whether it's just cultural or because it's the imperative of the human explorer spirit, or because there are financial gains to be had, the moon is there and ready for us if we can garner the resources to get there. So we have just a few minutes for a couple of questions. Are there any questions? Yes.
So are there any choices for current people that might go if we do go?
Choices meaning people to be selected?
Yeah, is there anyone like that they're thinking about sending?
I'm going to break down your question. And I'm going to focus on the word that they are thinking about sending, because there are some efforts with NASA. The Artemis program is looking at sending American astronauts back to the moon, including female astronauts. But a large portion of this, as Tony was just alluding, is this unknown private sector. So rather than thinking of it as they sending it, really may have everything to do with who wants to go and who's willing to buy the ticket. This Japanese entrepreneur had the resources to be able to do it and underwrite Elon Musk's, partly underwrite Elon Musk's vision of sending people to the moon.
And I believe the Artemis program, the NASA program, would use NASA astronauts who are currently trained. They would volunteer and select from that group that already exists. So
Yeah.
we may know some of the people, but we just don't know who specifically right now.
But more and more, I think part of the emphasis is that it's not so much a national effort where then a small organization selects the proper few. As it becomes commercially viable, then what it takes is the ability to buy a ticket. Other questions? Yes. Sorry, hang on here.
Question: do you know, like in YouTube, there's like these videos that like UFOs and stuff? Is that caused by the moon or somewhere else? Or
The-
that's just fake?
The question is about YouTube videos of UFO. Is it caused by the moon? And I don't really know of any connection between the moon and those UFO videos. Many, many, many videos are either fake or just mistaken.
I've seen some news, fake news. I don't really know.
You know, it's interesting. You're the second person in the audience, and in both cases under the age of 18, to talk about the way in which artwork and imagery is faked. And how important that is in our understanding of what's real and what's not real. And it is so much easier. We talked about this during the hoax, no hoax thing, that they didn't have the technology 50 years ago to fake a moon landing. That computer-generated technology, all of that, we could fake it now, sort of, with computers generating it, but we couldn't have faked it 50 years ago. 50 years ago, you had cameras and film, and it was grainy, and there was nothing special about it. So I think you've raised a really important question. How do you know what's real?
If I can just say too, I answer a lot of questions from people because the Astronomical Observer, quite often those questions come to me, I saw this in the sky or I took a picture of this. And often it's just reflections off lenses and things. And there are people who want to get you to believe that that is a flying saucer. And even though they know it's a reflection in the lens, they'll post it online saying, this was the planet Nibiru and, and stuff like that. And, most of that is nonsense.
I think it's a good time to say there is a process within the scientific community of looking for evidence, publishing that evidence, and having it be repeatable by others. So I took a picture, and here's this dot. Could be anything. And so, Carl Sagan once said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So a single person's picture is not extraordinary evidence, but, I know there's certainly, this has been back in the news a lot, and it just takes a critical ear and eye to try to determine, is the evidence strong enough, and is it supported broadly enough to merit a second look?
You got it.
Question here. Okay, we'll do 1, 2, 3, and then we'll end. Yeah.
So you spoke earlier about a consistent goal that would be possible really to explore the moon further. Can commercialization be that? Could we have a sandals resort on the moon? And that be the reason why we're going there, is just merely so people can put their foot in the lunar sand and enjoy the view of Earth?
I think it's all part of the fun, but I think, to make it economically viable up front, I think I've been lucky. I live in Colorado, and I go to the School of Mines every year, and they have a space resources roundtable, and this last one just a few months ago was amazing. NASA showed, all these private groups showed, but the key thing is people are doing little experiments in their labs. They're trying to simulate what the lunar soil is going to react to mining operations. We're not going to know without going. A lot of this machinery is going to fail. People are going to need to kick it. Whatever's going to happen. But the moon is the testing ground for a lot of this economic benefit of the moon. But I think it's going to be a little of everything. I think the tourism potential, mining, sightseeing from the far side of the moon. I don't know what it's going to be, but radio astronomy. it reminds me a little bit of the International Space Station. We didn't know what the value of the International Space Station was going to be. And now it turns out to be this huge test bed of everything. All kinds of equipment and life support hardware. So it's a combination of all those. You want all that to happen because there will be certain things that don't match up and fall to the wayside. So I see astronomy and space science and economic potential of whether it's helium-3 on the moon. I think, again, we're going to have a lot of surprises about the consistency of the moon. So, and then big one is the water ice. Can you transform water ice from the poles that you find there into rocket fuel, breathable oxygen, this kind of thing? Because there are companies that actually want to buy fuel made from the moon already. They made a bid on it. So we'll see.
And I think Elon Musk's vision for like the Starship is more what you were asking about, to bring the cost of launching down so low that people could afford vacation hops to the moon or something like that.
Yes.
You mentioned earlier about the moon dust being like sticky. Is there a material that it doesn't stick to, and do you know why it's sticky?
The question is about the stickiness of moon dust, and I believe the primary reason is because it's got an electrostatic charge, meaning it's charged particle, just like when you're shuffling along on the carpet and then you stick a balloon on your head. It's because you're messing with the charges, the electrical charge of your hair and your feet and so forth. So that dust is in sunlight. It's getting electrical charge. There isn't much gravity and there's no atmosphere, so the stuff flies around and it sticks to everything. It gets in the wheels, it gets in the gears, it gets in everything. So I think it pretty much sticks to most everything. I'm sure people are working, maybe Leonard, you know a little bit more about progress in that area because it's a real challenge.
Well, Disneyland of dust, that's the moon. I mean, it's really amazing.
That's the eighth dwarf is Dusty.
Yeah, really. Yeah, it's Dusty. So yeah, they'll come up with new ways. But again, this thing, we always have these problems. It's all the microgravity, radiation. We're going to have the dust problem. We solve those things. I think we're going to solve all those. And there's already an experiment that's coming along in the next few years to microwave the lunar surface to actually put a sheen on the top of it. Can you stop dust from floating around? And there are people looking at architectures around a habitat where you'd actually make a little roadway around this thing so it wouldn't kick up as much dust. So I think we're very clever.
Yeah.
If you
Well,
want
that's
to
a good
go, we can be
reminder.
really clever.
Yeah, we are clever, so that's good, because I'm more the cynic. I guess I'm just a few years behind you. Maybe I'll get optimistic again. Last question.
Yeah, so during the course of these wonderful talks, we've been focusing a lot on the government and private interests for the moon and beyond space travel. I kind of want to shine a light a bit more on the public interest. I mean, during the time of Apollo, there was global and obviously national, excitement around the ability to explore the unknown. But as we talked about in previous talks too, there's this notion of been there, done that for a lot of people. Now, what would have to happen, in your guys' opinion, culturally, for us to be excited again to go beyond the realms of what we know?
I'll try to repeat the question for the live stream. This gentleman wants to turn away from the government and private sector to the public interest on the moon, about the moon, harkening back to the time of Apollo when the public was so excited about it, and we don't see that so much today. So what will it take to bring about that kind of public fascination again? I'll turn to you guys first, and then I'll take a stab.
Well, I think if the moon offered something to us that benefits us as a society, that would at least help support interest in it. I think when we went to the moon in up to 1972, the feeling was, well, it's dusty and dry, and well, there's really nothing there that's intrinsically valuable. And I think it's the discovery of water deposits and better understanding of the mineral distribution on the moon, and that has reawakened a lot of interest. I remember when Clementine discovered ice deposits, suddenly people were talking about the moon again. So that's part of it. I don't know if there would ever be the widespread interest that we saw in 1969. And that was kind of a shallow interest in that not everybody wanted to continue exploring the moon just because we had landed on it. And one last thing on that, I think even the moon turned out to be an unexpected benefit to us in that it didn't open up our exploration of the solar system, but it improved our technology so much that it benefited the United States and now worldwide. If you interacted with a computer, you're doing something that only Apollo astronauts were doing in 1969. I mean, actually doing the programming or benefiting from software.
And miniaturization.
Yeah,
One
miniaturization. all that
thing
stuff.
that I highlighted in the book, and I actually had the most fun writing a section of that, was answering the question, and you probably all asked this, if we can go to the moon, why can't we, you fill in the blank? That is one of the benefits of Apollo. It gave some kind of gold standard of achievement of humans. And you go look at the moonshot theories of cancer research. There's all kinds of things that are being equated to, as includes cybersecurity. If we can go to the moon, why can't we solve this problem? And that, I think, has really gets to your point about public benefit of Apollo. It gave us a standard of achievement. Even though it's 50 years old, you got to blow the lunar dust off this anniversary. We're still talking about it.
Exactly. I'm going to take a little bit of a different turn and say something about sort of the emotional state of the public, because I think and I'm looking back to my own childhood and looking back even before I was born, all the Collier's artwork, it was in the imagination. And the idea of sending people to the moon was romantic and fantastic. And then you had Star Trek, and it was a vision of the future that was hopeful, and it was a new frontier, and the problems of Earth could be solved by moving out and getting a broader perspective and having a larger embrace of what it meant to be human. And I think that is still really important, even though we're a bit more jaded and sophisticated these days. I think that we have to be optimistic and believe that there is a brighter future. That is a very hard thing to do right now. And I think about my mother, who was born in 1916. And at the time of the World Trade Center tragedy, I was devastated, as everybody was. And she said, "Oh, honey, we've been through this before." She lived through Pearl Harbor. There's always a pendulum. It always comes back. When things look darkest, they're darkest just before the dawn. And we've seen that. I mean, it certainly is mirrored in economic cycles and things like that, but it's also mirrored in emotional and spiritual cycles. And I think this is just a personal reflection, but it's very interesting watching social media, because certainly there is a lot of cynicism out there. There's a lot of great humor as well. And I think like is attracted to like. And it will take the development of a positive outlook, voices for optimism, which I'm working to get back to. I'm still struggling to get back to being optimistic about our future. And I think, just echoing what Leonard said, if we can go to the moon, I mean, we are facing some serious problems with our climate on Earth. And if we can pull together as a planet and address some of the issues that we need to solve here, and we don't have much of a choice, I think that will go a long way to pulling together our belief in our ability to solve problems globally, because this will be a global effort. So I think there are certainly economic and tangible returns, but I think there's a spiritual component to this that is kind of up to us to be the leaders for. Thank you. So, we have one more, and I can't resist a young woman in mouse ears. Yes, go ahead.
Does the moon have access
Does the moon have oxygen? Not oxygen to breathe. So it doesn't have an atmosphere, but there's oxygen tied up in rocks. So if we can boil up those rocks and get the oxygen off that, we can pull oxygen from the rocks. So that's a great question. So with that, we like to thank you for coming to this long day of celebration. We wanted to get everybody out before the Greek concert started down at the Greek Theater tonight, because that always adds to the traffic. But we thank you for coming. I hope you will come back to Leonard's talk on Moonrush. We have a talk on Monday night from Griffith Observatory director about the context and meaning of having gone to the moon in terms of the long path of human history. And then we will conclude on the 24th, the last day, with All Space Considered remembering Apollo 11, because we won't have had enough. So you can see any of these by coming. You can also see the Moon Rush and the All Space Considered on YouTube or Griffith Observatory TV. So thank you once again, and have a wonderful afternoon.